Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Shama Venkateshwar. I'm the director of the public policy program here at Hunter College and also a distinguished lecturer. On behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb and Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer, I'd like to welcome you tonight to a very timely and important book talk with Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez's book, Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants. The book is here. It's also available upstairs during reception, so I hope you might join us. We will also have an interlocutor, Christian Farias, writer in residence at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. So welcome, everyone. Their bios are in the handout that you all have, so I won't take up too much of your time. Cesar's book could not have come at a more timely moment. He presents an in-depth look at the imprisonment of immigrants. He addresses the intersectionality between criminal justice and immigration. He calls this crimmigration over the last 30 years. And he argues that the federal and state governments have increasingly tapped their powers and the resources that they have to incarcerate people accused of violating immigration laws. So as a result, almost 400,000 people annually find themselves in incarceration while they are waiting criminal proceedings or civil proceedings against them. So this immigration imprisonment that started in the mid-1980s and the growth of the prison, the private prison system, the private prison industrial complex, if you will, disproportionately impacts Latinos and people of color. And we, of course, continue to witness this devastation of these policies on our southern border even today, as we look at the detention centers that are contracted out and run by private prisons and private detention centers, for whom an overriding motive is, of course, shareholder value. And this is what sort of keeps center of mind for them as they go about their daily operations, managing people who are trapped in these detention centers. Our public events at Roosevelt House, the courses that we teach, the research that our brilliant students and faculty do, many I see some faculty members here, are engaged and draw from frameworks of social justice, human rights, democracy, and equity. So it's only fitting that tonight's event that looks at human rights violations perpetuated by immigration and criminal justice policies is being held in this house. And in this room, where FDR's 4 freedoms are enshrined on that back wall: freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship. Eleanor Roosevelt became the global voice of human rights, and she later guided the Universal Declaration of Human Rights towards adoption by the United Nations. So as you listen to the discussion tonight, I want to urge you to keep 2 relevant articles in mind. Article 13 of the Declaration states, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. And Article 14 says, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. I know this is going to be a thoughtful and much needed discussion, and I'm eager to begin our conversation with our 2 participants. But before I do, let me remind you there's a reception that will follow right after and a big book signing. So without further ado, let me introduce and welcome our 2 speakers and turn to Christian Farias. Thank you.
Thank you to the Roosevelt House. It is a pleasure to be here. I send greetings from the Knight Institute at Columbia University. It's a First Amendment institute that guards one of the freedoms that Roosevelt cared about, which is freedom of speech. And my project in particular deals a lot with migration and the intersection between freedom of expression and how that freedom almost doesn't exist when it comes to migrants' rights. If you're an advocate, if you're a journalist, if you're an immigrant, if you're a researcher, you almost don't have First Amendment rights because you see it all the time with people crossing the border, with people that are reporting on these things. They're getting cracked down on by the government. And I am extremely pleased to be here with Cesar, whom I know for many years. Matter of fact, this here is his first book, Crimmigration Law. I received it in the mail many years ago when it first came out in 2015, I believe, right? And when I read it, as someone who went to law school, I was just impressed by how in-depth Cesar goes into this history between how immigration law and criminal law intersect, and it's almost like an unholy marriage. And it's full of footnotes, and by his own admission, I was talking to him earlier, it's out of date by now, right?
It is. But I'm working on the second edition.
So now tell me.
It has like 1,000 footnotes. My research assistant counted them recently.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And if you read it, it's almost like a resource. Like if you ever want to know anything that there is to know about almost all of the subjects in his book, they're distilled here. But I'm not going to tell you to buy this. I'm going to tell you to get this. And I want to ask you, Cesar, how do you go from writing what is basically a legal treatise on crimmigration to writing something that is for public consumption?
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here with me tonight, and thank you all for coming out here. They're radically different beasts, but I think that the underlying the theme of both is to try to unearth this intersection of criminal law and immigration law that people who have been working in this space have been seeing happening in the lives of clients, and certainly migrants and their families are seeing this play out in their own personal lives. And so the shift was really one not so much about the substantive focus, but who I was trying to speak to. Right, so my day job is as a professor at the University of Denver. In that sense, I'm reaching in the first book students, attorneys, and that's a comfortable space for me. That's something that I do every day. I do it happily. But the story of imprisonment is one that is overlooked a lot of times in conversations about immigration law, and so I really wanted to focus on taking the material that is uncovered in the first book and really honing in on this pernicious way of using imprisonment to enforce immigration law, but to do so for folks who are not gonna who have no interest and should not in making their way through a treatise that has a thousand footnotes.
Absolutely. And one thing that struck me about this book and the way you wrote it, as a journalist, you use a lot of real-life stories, where one book focused on the law and the case law and the statutes and the regulations, and it's very intricate that way. This one actually brings real-life stories of some of your clients. You are one of the few law professors who actually has real-life clients that you represent. And I'm curious how that representation of real people whose lives are at stake informs your own work.
Yeah, well, I'm lucky in that I'm not the only immigration lawyer in my family. My two brothers are immigration lawyers as well, and yeah, and so my oldest brother started a law firm years ago as a solo practitioner, and then the two younger brothers joined up with him, and so that has helped me immensely in that it allows me to keep a footing in what's actually happening in the immigration courtrooms in the United States, but more specifically than that, in South Texas, which is the region where I was born and raised, but also the part of the United States in which my family law firm is based, and that's an important part of this story because I've spent most of my adult life in larger cities in the Northeast and the last 6 years or so in Denver, where there are much more robust legal services communities. That's not the case in places like McAllen, where I was born and raised, where we have an office that one of my brother's staffs full time, and that's one of the cities nearest to a place like the Port Isabel Detention Center, a 1,500 or so bed facility that's been there since the 80s. I didn't know it existed growing up there. Most of the people who are in this area to this day don't know that it's there, and so that has been an enormously beneficial part of the story, but also helps explain why it is that I cared. Why it is I care about this topic? Because for me, it's not just something that is intellectual. It certainly isn't something that's just a professional interest. It's a real personal interest. It's an interest that's derived from the fact that the folks who I see in facilities across the United States don't strike me as all that different from me in many ways.
Absolutely. And I don't want to spoil the book for folks who haven't read it, but you get a little personal in the book. You talk about your family, you talk about your father, and you talk about this very interesting life of having one foot in Mexico and one foot in the US, and just kind of inhabiting both countries, and how in that life there's almost no boundaries. And I'm curious, and I want you to share a little bit, if you want, with the audience about what that is like, and how also that informs a lot of what you do.
Yeah, certainly. I was born and raised in South Texas, but my family's story is certainly it's one in which migration has been a part of our lives for as long as we've been, well, longer than I've been around, and in that sense, it's not unusual. And I think that's a big part of the point that I'm trying to make in Migrating to Prison, is that when we think of immigration law and immigration policy, so often we hear migrants described as some kind of extraordinary being. And this comes from both the right and the left. On the right, you have the Trump version of things, which is the gang members and the boogeyman. These people who are bloodthirsty. But from the left, it's a very different framing, but also one of exceptionalism, with this sense of people who are just sort of lacking in agency a lot of times, who don't have an option but to come to the United States, and of course, there's bits of both of those versions that are true, but the reality is that most of the time, migrants are just ordinary people like you, like at least like me. I'm Facebook friends with him. I watch what he does on the weekends. More ordinary people like me, who yes, we have our good days, and I certainly like to when I reflect on myself, I certainly like to focus on those good moments. But when I'm being honest with myself, I realize that my good moments are certainly dotted by worse moments.
When there was that part of your book reminded me, when you're talking about your father and your family, reminded me of that terrible, awful tragedy that happened in El Paso, where a shooter came in and shot indiscriminately at people at a Walmart. People that were not immigrants or migrants. These are people that live on both sides of the border. They sleep on one side, they go to school and work on the other side. And for many people, there's that people that are from here, from the US, they can't fathom that people live that way without any sense of border, without any sense of boundaries of any kind.
Well, so I'd push back a little bit on that.
Sure.
That there's no sense of boundaries, but actually that the boundary has transformed, right? So I was born in McAllen, Texas, which is 7 miles north of the Rio Grande River, and as a child. Our lives transcended that border for everything from the most mundane, the lunch trips on the weekends, to those special moments, the weddings and quinceañeras. But in that 40 years since then, I've also had the the unhappy privilege of getting to see the way that this boundary has evolved from one that was very much a unifier in that it's the reason, the river is the reason why there is life in what is a difficult semi-arid part of the United States. But as we've literally seen it built up. And I remember very clearly the first time that I was walking to Reynosa, which is the Mexican city just across the border from where I grew up. And I was walking with my siblings to go have lunch at the one favorite restaurant that we have. And I remember we all just stopped in our tracks the moment that for the first time we saw the wall that is there, right? And none of us said anything. We just stopped and we stared at it because it was this enormous scar in our community. And more recently, this sort of a similar development where last summer the Trump administration rolled out this migrant protection protocol thing, to Remain in Mexico policy, and as part of the enforcement strategy, they set up these chain link fences staffed by 1 or 2 Border Patrol agents right at the center line of the bridges, because these are bridges that connect the 2 ports of entry and over the river. And there's these hilarious tactics because the chain link fences, first of all, they're flimsy, right? So if somebody actually wanted to bust through them, they could. But secondly, they're just on the sidewalk. Right next to the sidewalk is the street where the cars travel, right? And between the two, there's like a 3-foot barrier. I mean, I could step over that, right? Nonetheless, if somebody who's really wanting to circumvent the enforcement folks who are standing there, but it's a reminder that these enforcement tactics, whether they're prisons, whether they're laws, there's some amount of them that's supposed to be a real thing, and there's a whole lot of it that's just symbolic. They're using these concrete masses to communicate some message to somebody, and it's that messaging that's, I think, extremely, extremely important in these conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I guess that's a good segue into the actual meat and potatoes of your book. And the way you put it in the way you write your book, for you, basically, you lay out very clearly how there was a time when we as a nation, the US, was not obsessed with immigration imprisonment. You also, I love the fact that you use that term, immigration imprisonment. I don't think I've seen anyone put it in those terms. We call it detention facilities or,
family residential centers.
Yes, exactly. But you call it immigration imprisonment. That's the word that you use. You call them immigration prisoners. That was a very deliberate choice on your part.
It was.
But take us back to that time when the U.S. didn't lock up immigrants and why that was.
So for me, in the process of doing the research that led to migrating to prison, one of the most fascinating, mind-boggling parts of this history that I've learned about is a moment in the 1950s where the official policy of the United States government is actually to shut down several of the facilities that existed at the time. So in 1954, the Eisenhower administration decided that it was going to shut down a number of facilities, including, most importantly, most symbolically, because of its symbolic value, a facility on Ellis Island. Lots of folks who have studied immigration law are familiar with a woman named Ellen Knopf. Ellen Knopf is this woman who litigated a case all the way to the Supreme Court, and so it's this horrible due process case from the middle of the 50s. But her story is largely forgotten. So she was born in Czechoslovakia during World War II. She fled to the UK, went to work for the Royal Air Force. Eventually, she went to work for the U.S. Military, and that's when she met a guy named Kurtnoff, U.S. citizen, a veteran of the U.S. Army. They got married, fell in love, got married, right? Very common story. So common, in fact, that Congress had enacted a special law called the War Brides Act to allow U.S. citizen soldiers to bring their new loves, their new wives back to the U.S. So That's exactly the immigration procedure that the NOFs use to get her back. She lands on Ellis Island. Immigration officials say, no, you're dangerous. We're not going to tell you why you're dangerous, but your presence here is, as the courts put it, prejudicial to the interest of the United States. So we're going to send you to this secure facility on Ellis Island, which she describes in a memoir that she publishes years later as having a series of watchtowers and the look of kennels, she says. And I think the kennels language is an important one because these days, fast forward, whatever, all these many years later from the 50s, and many of the folks who are detained in Border Patrol holding stations along the Southwest describe those facilities as perreras, as kennels, or dog pounds, right? I assure you, I know how many years it took me to find this long, unpublished memoir that Ellen Knopf wrote. No one who is coming from Central America has read about Ellen Knopf or read her memoir. I can guarantee you that much because I know how much I struggled to get this book. But the same imagery is being evoked. All of these in these two completely different contexts, and so she writes about this, and yet that facility on Ellis Island, which she described as being like kennels, is one that the Eisenhower administration in 1954 says, look, we've been detaining people for several decades. We're going to stop. This is the 1950s, mid 50s. The Soviet Union is rising in power. Not only that, the Cold War is not just ideological. It's not just ideological fights. Korea had already happened, right? So it had actually turned into military engagements on battlefields. And yet the Eisenhower administration viewed this period of time in the middle of the 1950s as a moment in which it could shut down all of these facilities. And these days we hear, well, we need to lock up immigrants because so many of them are here to do nefarious things, or so many of them are here in flouting immigration law. Well, there were people in these facilities, and we let them out. And the New York Times reported about this in November 1954. They reported about Arne Peterson, and it said he was a Norwegian seaman who overstayed his shore leave. Immigration lawyers know overstaying. Overstaying means he had permission, they had the government's permission to come here for a certain period of time, and then he didn't leave. Right? So he was violating immigration law by being here. Not only did the U.S. government know that, we knew where he was. He was in the custody of the U.S. government, and it was the U.S. government that stuck him on, as the New York Times put it, on a battery-bound ferry. They just put him on a ferry into Manhattan, and not the U.S. government or anyone else knows what happened to Arne Peterson after that. And yet, the whole thing didn't come tumbling down.
So in 1954, something big happened in the U.S. too. That was the year of Brown v. Board of Education. Yeah. It was, I guess, a transformative moment for the nation. But unbeknownst to people who were paying attention to the civil rights movement, this other thing was happening in the immigration realm. And but something broke down. The Supreme Court, years later, you noted in your book, called this kind of a moment of enlightenment or something like that. The fact that we no longer are relying on immigration imprisonment.
That was a quote from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it was a quote from the Supreme Court. Yes, yes. And we'll get to the Supreme Court in a bit because I have a bone to pick. But anyway, tell me, in the decades that came after, what happened to us that we all of a sudden went back to locking up immigrants?
Yeah, what happened was racism started to take a more prominent place in the development of immigration law and policy in the late 70s.
Well, let me stop you there. But we already had a long lineage of racism going back to the late.
No, we did.
1800s.
Which is when the earlier version of some of these facilities started popping up. Right. And in the late 19th century, in particular in San Francisco, where Chinese were coming and being excluded as the 19th century came to a close.
So we decided to revisit that odious history.
Only on the scale of the late 20th century newfound fascination with incarceration. So we're all familiar with the story of the war on drugs-related mass incarceration. That develops out of Reagan administration decisions to use this illicit drug activity as a political ploy to woo white voters in particular. But which is concretized, it's made real through a series of laws that Congress adopts and then pours money into. Well, the immigration prison system that we have today was born at the same period of time, but not just sort of coincidentally in the same moment. It wasn't even just the same political environment. It was the same pieces of legislation. You have laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, both of which, as their name suggests, really focus on the early moments of the war on drugs, right, and criminalizing and punishing drug-related activity. They also expand the authority that the federal government has to lock up immigrants. 1990, Immigration Act of 1990. President George H.W. Bush signs that into law, and when he does, he says something, I'm going to paraphrase here, but he says something like, this is a centerpiece of my administration's war on drugs. The Immigration Act is a centerpiece of his administration's war on drugs, right? So to prominent members of Congress, to presidents at the time, they viewed the the need to imprison their way into or through an attention on illicit drug activity in this as akin to the need to do that with immigrants as well.
You kind of left us right at the brink of the Clinton, Bush II, and Obama administrations. They have their own demons about immigration. But before we get there, where was the Supreme Court in all of this? And I ask because for many people, and for me also, who, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a lawyer, and it's mind-boggling that immigration law, it's almost as if the Constitution doesn't apply in this space. Where in criminal law, you have Fourth Amendment protections, Sixth Amendment protections, and all these other procedural safeguards before the government even attempts to lock you up. None of these things apply, or maybe minimally, in the immigration context. And yet,
yeah.
Where are the judges? Where are the justices?
When Ellen Knopf's case gets to the Supreme Court, the court gives us this fantastic line that I try to drill into the minds of all of my students. Whatever procedure authorized by Congress is, it is due process as far as the alien denied entry is concerned. That is, we give Congress the power to decide what due process is. Right? Outside of the immigration context, that's crazy. That's what the courts get to tell us what due process is, not Congress. Right? That's somewhat of an antiquated decision, but one that is very much still alive, one that is still showing up in briefs that are being used in court these days. And so the Supreme Court has time and time again proving itself quite willing to give a rather broad, impressive amount of latitude to executive branch immigration officials when it comes to how they go about enforcing immigration law in all manners, including their willingness to do so through the use of imprisonment. And so the major limiting factor is political.
Absolutely. I'll have you know that the Supreme Court has even been lied to by the federal government with misleading data, and they have still upheld immigration imprisonment.
They've been caught. They've had to disclose that, and still it's gone their way time and time again.
Absolutely, and I guess once you have the blessing of the courts, then of course Congress and the executive continue passing more laws, and now we get to the Clinton era.
Right, so and in a bipartisan manner, right? These are certainly not Republican-led, solely Republican initiatives, and I think that's an important part of the story of the development of this policy. So it starts. I talked about the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration was actually just concretizing a policy that was created in an ad hoc fashion by the Carter administration before it, in a very very haphazard fashion in the 70s. But so this starts off with the bipartisan support, and that doesn't stop with Bush, the first Bush, with Clinton. We get to the Obama years, and we see that the largest immigration prison population in the history of the United States comes to us under President Obama until President Trump. And so we see one moment after another in which there is sort of a political gamemanship that's happening here, in which we keep ratcheting up the pressure on migrants, and prisons are a central feature of the way that that's happening.
Absolutely. One thing that many people are surprised to know, and you know, as a journalist and as scholars, we're inundated with news every day about new initiatives being rolled out by the current administration with respect to immigration enforcement. But Congress hasn't passed any new laws under the Trump administration to give it this power.
No,
These are laws of Congress that have been in effect for decades, and all Trump is doing is just making use of them.
Right. Well, they're getting money, right, from Congress. So certainly, the purse strings are an absolutely very important
Sure.
part of
money.
this, right? How much money you have to hire ICE officers, to hire Border Patrol agents, to pay private prison corporations to
Right.
to operate facilities on your behalf.
But as far as
But
enforcement
the
tools,
law,
right.
yeah, the laws aren't new, right? And well, the laws are remarkably resilient in the face of a newfound interest by a lot of advocates to really try to push back hard on what the Trump administration is doing. I think that is wholly appropriate. I welcome that. But the laws as passed by Congress are showing just simply how much leeway the Supreme Court in particular has given to them.
And the way oftentimes that these laws are written in this era, in the past 3 years, we have looked to judges to put a little bit of a check on some of the excesses that we're seeing. But a lot of times Congress doesn't even give people the right to sue over these things. Like you can't even challenge the legality of some of these actions. Just today, I don't know if you saw this in the news, DHS announced a new program to speed up the border wall construction. And basically, the Department of Homeland Security secretary is invoking the Real ID Act of 2005, which I was shocked to learn gives them the right to waive contracts. Basically, you don't have to follow the laws of federal contracting in order to build a wall or to
Procurement guidelines.
procurement
yeah,
guide, right,
applies to
exactly.
federal government.
And when I read the statute, he literally can waive any law in the books.
It allows them to waive environmental review and antiquities concerns about archaeological.
But this law got passed
concerns.
by Democrats and Republicans,
Right.
giving
Two
DHS
administrations ago.
complete authority to basically say, hey, look, I don't want the law to apply. I want to speed up this thing, and because I want to carry out this or that project.
Yeah. So I think for me it's constantly important to remind myself that the situation that we're currently in is not one that started in January 2017 when Donald Trump walked into the White House, and it certainly isn't going to end the day that he walks out of the White House, whenever that is, and no matter who replaces him. So I think this is a moment in which there is an opportunity to think critically about what we're doing, but not to fall into some false hope that this is all of a sudden gonna end after November's election.
Thank you for that. And I guess this is a good segue, I guess, to the, what you hope this book accomplishes. You wrote in the New York Times about this, and your call to action, if you will, is to abolish immigration imprisonment outright. And how do we get there? How do we do that?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly don't. I try not to be egomaniacal, so I don't claim, and I say this in the book, I don't claim to know have a step-by-step plan for getting from here to there. We currently lock up 400,000 or 500,000 people every year. I don't know exactly how to go from that to zero. Frankly, I don't even know all the right questions to ask. But I do know that needs to be the ultimate end goal. Because if it's not, I know what the alternative looks like. I know that the alternative looks like what we see right now and what's been metastasizing into the present day. But I think that we can take some clear steps in that direction. And I wrote about this. I read about this in the book. I wrote about this a little bit in the Times piece that you referenced. That we can start by tapping some of the experiences that we've had going back to the Reagan years, in which there have been pilot projects, a series of pilot projects that test the usefulness of supporting people who are going through the immigration process, legal process, by starting off by providing folks with access to legal representation. Most of the people who are detained by ICE, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, while they're going through the legal process these days, they have to do it without lawyers. They have to do it by themselves. So they're fighting they're making their last fight for staying in the United States against a trained government prosecutor. What is I like to think of it as effectively as being blindfolded with your hands tied behind your back. I'm a lawyer and a law professor, and my wife is as well. I have 2 brothers who are lawyers. I have a sister-in-law who's a lawyer. I'm surrounded by lawyers. When I have a legal problem, I don't turn to my family to help me. I hire somebody to do it, right? And certainly I'm in the privileged position of not having to deal with the kinds of high-stakes matters that the folks who are in these facilities are. And so that's something that I'm going to do. Certainly I think it's because I understand the benefit. But lawyers are only part of the answer. Lawyers are not the whole answer. I like to start with lawyers because I am a lawyer. But
what about things like, for example, what California is trying by abolishing
pushing out the private prisons?
Private prisons.
So certainly, this is when I travel around the country talking to activists, this is something that they're grappling with intensely. Do we try to push private prisons out of our communities? This is something I know is a real issue here in New York as well. Or are we concerned that if we push folks or prisons out of California, they're just going to end up in Arizona or Nevada? That's a real concern. I think the approach that a lot of the activists who I've been talking to in recent months are taking is the sense that there's a long-term strategy about raising the costs of operating the system. So pushing people out of a particular community raises the cost of operating these facilities, and perhaps that is a meaningful starting point. The other thing that I'll add as somebody who talks to folks in various places is that what happens in California, what happens in New York in particular, reverberates. Folks, you all here set the high watermark for what most of us in the rest of the country can only dream about, right? So when New York City decides to fund a legal defense program for immigrants, and then advocates are able to expand that beyond just the city. Outside of New York, I mean that sets a model for what it is that we might aspire to do, and then try to replicate that outside. So that's I think that's powerful. That messaging role is powerful. That modeling role. It's also an enormous responsibility. So no pressure.
So hopefully from this these laboratories of democracy, as states are known, maybe this will spread to other parts of the country. I guess this is a good way to segue to questions from the audience, and we've had a really interesting discussion, but I'm sure you also have other questions for Cesar about his book, about immigration more generally. Maybe you have a really nerdy question about how the law works, or whether it's legal for the Trump administration to target states like New York and California for precisely ending immigration imprisonment, or for passing a driver's license law that shields certain undocumented immigrants. I guess now we'll ask if people have questions. Raise your hand and a mic will come to you.
Greetings. I live on the other side of the river in that other borough, New Jersey, and I'm active in the immigration advocacy there. And I visit someone weekly in the Hudson jail. It's his third year from ICE. And what I'm seeing when I talk to local officials, they are making so much money from the ICE contract. And they say all the money's going to the care, but we know that's not true. And they pitch this line that they are taking better care than if the immigrants are sent off to Arizona, Nevada, what have you. In my advocacy, I visit someone who's actually in detention 3 years, 2 months now, and things are, quote, pending. He does have a lawyer through legal aid. And it's such a cash cow. So one of the questions for us to answer is how we answer that, because they're getting all this money.
Yeah, well, if all of the money were going to the care, then none of it would be going to the investors. Oh, these are county jails. Okay. Well, that's slightly different. They don't have investors; they have constituents. And I think this is it's easy to criticize private prison companies because they are very much explicitly profiting off of human bondage. Right, that's the goal, to profit off of human bondage. But the local governments that also rent out bed space. Maybe it's the whole facility, maybe it's just part of the facility, also have a financial incentive at stake. Maybe they took out some debt to cover the remodeling of the facility or the expansion of the facility. Maybe it's just that they rely on this revenue for income. For jobs, and then their constituents rely on it for income. And I think that part of the story is an important one, because yes, it's important to be critical about the fact that the local elected officials are looking at prisons, whether it's an immigration prison or any other kind of prison, as an economic development strategy. But I think it's also important for advocates to keep in mind that those jobs are meaningful to those people. In places where I grew up in South Texas, working in a facility in Raymondville, Texas, that has about 1,500 beds in it, 1,500 beds in it, you get to work in air conditioning, right? That's meaningful. And what's the alternative? The alternative is to go out and pick the onions that surround the field. I mean, that's on a long-term economic development perspective. Yes, I think the local elected officials need to be pressured to adopt some other strategy. But in the short term, right, for the people who are working in those facilities, I think it's ethically problematic and politically short-sighted to just say, well, go find another job, right? And so I think advocates need to be cognizant of the fact that there are real folks who are not only locked up in these facilities, but real folks who are depending on these facilities for their livelihoods and everything that an income and a job means to most of us.
Hi, good evening. I'm a student here at Hunter, so I want to thank you again for being here tonight. I think my question sort of draws a little bit on your experience growing up in Southern Texas. I think it was like November of 2018 that a viral photo went out about in Tijuana, like the border at Tijuana, that Border Patrol agents used tear gas and rubber bullets on like Central American migrants that were attempting to cross. So I think my question is, to what extent do you think that there's a militarization of the southern border, and how do you think that has sort of progressed since 2018 and since more and more policies like MPP are rolled out?
Well, I mean, you can just look at the fact that there are members of the military deployed along the border to know that we are, to one extent or another, militarizing the border. Putting aside the National Guard troops, and when we have active military members of the military sent to the border. Just in the last few days, we've heard about the SWAT team style Border Patrol unit getting sent off to places like New York, Boston, etc. I find these stories fascinating. One, for one, because the reaction is rightly one of anger, right? Why are you going to send this SWAT team style border patrol group to New York City because you're pissed off about at us, to Boston, to San Francisco, right? The political motives behind these are so easy to see, right? But the other thing that's interesting to me is, of course, this isn't the new unit. It exists. It's existed for many years. Only it's existed in places like South Texas, right? And so the centers of the universe, if you will, the centers of attention, are far away from there. It doesn't make it any better, right? That BORTAC exists in McAllen, Texas, than that it does in New York City, right? And so that kind of that reality is one that has been lived in places along the southwestern border for a long time. But if there's any upside to these developments in the last few years under the Trump administration, it's the brazenness with which they are expanding border-centered policies outside of the border means that more people are paying attention. And I think that's long in coming, and so that much at least I welcome.
More questions? There you go.
Hi, Gina Damasco. Thank you very much for coming out. This has been fascinating, and I can't wait to read your book. So I'm a civil rights and human rights attorney for many years, and when you were speaking about due process, something had come up that in my experience that made me think of approaches that are being taken in advocacy. So in a particular case that I had been involved with, it was a human trafficking survivor who was on a T visa, who was then picked up for allegedly stealing something from someone she worked for. And while she was in detention waiting for that, she took a drug plea, through drug court, not realizing that and not being informed by her criminal attorney, the repercussions of that would be pretty devastating. She just thought it would help her, she'd get treatment, and she'd be out. And lo and behold, she shows up, she makes her plea, and they swoop her out like something out of the dirty war in Argentina, and you don't hear from her until like months later when a letter shows up. And so one of the things that sort of strikes me is, as we're doing this more of top-down approach, and I'm familiar with the great work that's being done in the ICE detention centers in New Jersey. I'm in New Jersey too, so yay. One of the questions I have is, to what extent do you advocate for small changes like that, where things procedurally that can't happen? You know what I'm saying? Like, advocate that in those particular circumstances that they'd have to be advised of those, the repercussions of that before they could make the plea that would then cause them to forfeit rights in devastating ways.
Yeah, I think the more information that folks have about the consequences of any decision that they make in the legal proceeding, the better off we are. And so fully advising folks is not only something that I think is ethically appropriate, it's something that's constitutionally required these days. But that doesn't mean that it's actually happening, right, on the ground. I think the role of lawyers and the role of social workers is something that is what I think of as an easy first step, because we currently have an imprisoned population in which most of the folks who are going through there are not represented by counsel, and I think lawyers are important not only because we understand the law that's relevant to somebody's life, or might understand that law. But also because we're eyes and ears that get to leave. And when you have an imprisoned population that is so difficult to access, because most of the big facilities are not in northern New Jersey, right? They're in places like Eloy, Arizona, Florence, Arizona. I mean, these places, like, they look like something I write in the book. They strike me like something out of the X-Files. You drive there at night and there's nothing. I mean, there's people who really like the desert would say there's all kinds of things. As somebody who doesn't, there's nothing, there's just darkness, and all of a sudden there's just this massive array of lights, right? And that means that there aren't eyes and ears walking in and walking out. There's not, and that means that what's happening behind that barbed wire fencing is largely unknown to most of us. The lawyers have privileged access to those facilities. I think we're important for that reason as well. Once you get people out, though, this is still a highly stressful process. So social workers are an integral part of what I would like to see us doing to move forward, because they can help people have some amount of stability in their lives, this emotional stability in their lives as they're going through a high-stakes legal process. Case managers who can help people figure out, where do you need to be, when do you need to be there, do you have a way of getting there, are your kids someplace? What are you doing with your kids, right, while you're in this hearing? And we go back to example after example, going back to the Reagan years, of a number of different kinds of pilot projects, sometimes run by the government, sometimes by the Vera Institute, other NGOs, and time again, they have remarkable success in keeping people on top of their court dates, keeping people out of trouble, and also helping people win more often.
Hi, Cesar. Thank you for coming. I'm Lenny Benson at New York Law School. Immigration is my field. I just wanted people to know that if they feel empowered and they want to take action this week, the New York Immigration Coalition is trying to get us all to write our state assembly, Senate members, and the governor, because the limited amount of state money that goes to legal representation of immigrants is at risk, may be cut. New York City is doing pretty well and has some really great projects, but it's insufficient too. We are the largest immigration court in the country. We have about 12,000 kids in the immigration court, most of whom are not detained, some still are, and close to, oh gosh, I keep losing the numbers, it's 400,000 cases pending in New York. So this is not, I think as Cesar's been saying, it's not just a story of the border is everywhere. And so something people can take action and do is maybe go to the New York Immigration Coalition, NYIC.org website, and learn how you can get involved in advocacy.
And to the extent that these political struggles are happening in New York, in the city, there's been some tension about, do we exclude people with certain criminal histories, very long list of certain criminal histories. The state, right, is also going back and forth about how much to support this. You know, imagine those political dynamics in other places, in places like Colorado, right, which is, yes, right now we have a Democratic-controlled legislature and governor's mansion. That's been true for the last 2 years, right? So these are not sort of permanent hallmarks of government where folks feel at liberty to just assume that they're going to get reelected over and over again. And certainly, you know, Denver is a large urban center that is still the exception in many parts of the country.
Now, I would like to use my executive privilege as moderator to ask the final question. And for the people who are here who perhaps see the deluge of news and all the changes that are happening in the immigration imprisonment complex, as it's called. Now, you're not a motivational speaker. You're a law professor and a scholar. But what do you tell people so that they don't, how do you encourage people not to give in to despair and not to lose hope? How do you kind of keep going and not lose it?
I think if you're a small D Democrat, then you have to be hopeful. The democracy is nothing if not an experiment in human failure. But one that chooses to dwell not on those moments in which the whole thing comes crumbling upon us, but in those moments in which we actually are able to be our best selves. Not to forget that we're also our worst selves. That in time and time again we've succumbed to the racism and the classism and the sexism, and time again in our individual lives we're doing things that we've done things that we wish we hadn't, and sometimes in the moment that we're doing them we can't stop ourselves from doing them, and yet we do them, right? because in the history of the United States is a history of outcasts. It's a history of antisocial people who have some amount of courage that they're able to muster and find their like-minded friends and push us a slightly closer to the unattainable dream that still sort of lingers over the horizon. And the moment that I stop believing in that, then I think I'm screwed.
So don't stop believing
So don't
in that.
stop believing in that.
All right, well, thank you, Cesar, for those wonderful words. And get the book, Migrating to Prison, and he'll be signing copies afterwards. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all.